grand réalisateur débute sa carrière aux côtés du légendaire Roger Corman, roi des films d'horreur de série B. Plus tard, il écrira un script qui lui vaudra son premier Oscar, Patton, film qui vaudra aussi à George C. Scott l'Oscar du meilleur acteur. Il se verra couronné de 4 autres Oscars et réalisera des films de tout genre, tels que Conversation secrète, Outsider, Rusty James et Cotton Club. Mais il marquera à tout jamais l'histoire du cinéma grâce à la célébrissime trilogie Le Parrain, brillamment interprété par Marlon Brando et Al Pacino, et à son film dérangeant et épique sur la guerre du Vietnam, Apocalypse Now.
Hello, I'm Francis Coppola, and I'm welcoming you to Hollywood's best film director, and I did not think of that title. We are here in Napa Valley in Rutherford, California, and we're in one of the rooms of the American Zoetrope Research Library, where all the research materials are kept, and in the other rooms are, of course, volumes of literature, philosophy. I think all in all in this building there are maybe 80,000 volumes. I was the second child. I had an older brother, a wonderful older brother, about 5 years older than me, and my father was the solo flute, first flute for the NBC Symphony under Arturo Toscanini. I recall going to the rehearsal of the NBC Symphony, and in fact I had an interesting experience in the control room of the NBC Studio 8H, which is where the orchestra rehearsed. There was a room we were allowed to go to, and had a big window, and you could see the orchestra, and I could see Toscanini striking red black with his gray hair and white hair. And there was a big wheel, I recall. It probably was just a knob, but to me it was a big wheel. And if you turned it to one side, you could hear the orchestra and the sound coming from the studio. And if you turned it to the other side, you couldn't hear. And that was when I first realized that picture and sound are not necessarily connected. Very important principle in the cinema. And my mother was a very beautiful woman. When she would come to school, the other students would say, "Oh, your mother is so beautiful, she looks like a movie star." She was a dark-haired woman, very striking, and so I guess you could say that that was the first image I saw, was her face. So her face and the sound of the flute was the first movie I think I recall.
I'm an engineer. I'm the best engineer there is.
As a kid, I always had a place with a workbench and where I could build devices and be like an inventor. And I used to make little electrical magnetic photovoltaic cells and devices that did things. And I remember once building a mechanical television. And when I was older, I actually built a television set that from a kit. And I also remember having a little, like a movie theater in our basement where we would show cartoons and, you know, invite kids for 25 cents to see the movie shows, and we would have a concession where we would sell lemonade.
I'd like to say the in-depth stuff for the second reading.
Of course, I wanted very much to be a playwright, and in my last year of school, I remember seeing a film that was being shown in one of the buildings that was a silent film called 10 Days That Shook the World by Sergei Eisenstein. And I was so impressed with this production that even though it was a silent film, it seemed to have sound, even though it was all through the magic of editing, that I decided not to go to the Yale Drama School where I thought I was going to go. And instead I went to the UCLA Film School and moved to California and became a film student. I answered an ad that was put up on the student board about Roger Corman was looking for a student to work as an assistant on a project. It was interesting because at that time I hadn't paid my phone bill because I didn't have much money, and I was very worried that I called and they said, "Well, give us your number, we'll call you back." And I was sitting by the phone hoping that my phone wouldn't get turned off before they called me back, but they called me back, a very nice woman, I remember her name, Kinta, interviewed me, and she asked me, "Well, can you speak Russian?" I said, "Well, no, or sort of, you know, what do you need?" And he had bought a Russian film, and he wanted someone to sort of, not exactly translate it into English, but to make up dialogue for it to fit into the mouth, to dub it into a different to make it more of a horror film than it was. But ultimately I got that job and I did that. One of my first films was called The Rain People, and it was a story I had written with Shirley Knight and James Caan, and this represented the direction I wanted to go into, original stories of my own that I would adapt or that I would write for film and then shoot in a very personal way, you know, which is, you know, obviously more of an independent style film. And I made that film, and really the film I wanted to make after that was The Conversation, of course, which was another more personal film, another story I had written myself, and ultimately was to star Gene Hackman. But, you know, it was hard to make that kind of personal film, to finance it. So it wasn't until after I made The Godfather that I was able to say, oh, I want to make The Conversation. And in a funny way, after The Conversation, had I not had the big accident of The Godfather becoming so successful and taking my life in another direction, I would have made Youth Without Youth as a more personal film. And now, after that, Tetro, I would have made that next, or maybe I would have made a film like Rumblefish. But my career would have been more the career of a young director trying to find his voice in original writing and style, and, you know, experimental enough to try to find my own way of expressing things.
Action!
When you sit down really to write a movie, it's probably not unlike an actor doing an improvisation, but you engage in an imaginary movie that you pretend that you're seeing, and seeing how it's shown and what the people are doing and what they're saying, and you sort of you set out on a little excursion of imagination, and then of course you write down what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what they're saying, and all of a sudden the door will open and someone will walk in that you didn't expect, and you're sort of following a thread that isn't really yet there, but it seems to be weaving itself through this act of visualization and improvisation. And ultimately then, you know, I've learned to just put that down on paper and not even when I'm done for the morning even to read it, because I'm enjoying the impression I had, and if I were to read it I might be disappointed or suddenly turn against it or think it wasn't very good. And then the next day I just pick up where I was, and again I engage in that little improvisation, and you know, after 2 days I'll have maybe 10 pages, and so then I feel, wow, I have something, but I still won't read it, and I'll do that like that. Sometimes I'll stop and I'll do a little step outline and say, well, let me see, okay, 1, he meets her. 2, she tells him such and such, and I'll maybe do, but I'll only do 6 or 7 steps. I won't do all the steps, and then I'll just use that as a guide, and I'll continue this little act of sort of promiscuous imagination. It's just like daydreaming, really. The whole idea behind One from the Heart was just pure and simply that it was going to be live cinema, just as there had been live television in the early decade after World War II. There were many really great, this is before videotape was invented, so the only kind of television was live television. And the director would sit and he could see what each camera was getting, and the actors, if there were actors, would be proceeding, and they would say camera 3, camera 2, and some of them were really masterful, and in particular the live television of John Frankenheimer was far and above the most impressive live television being done, and he would do dramas that or pieces that would be like cinema, and it was just done once, and they would just literally make show you an entire movie in one day. I thought, well, why couldn't we make a film that way? And that was my plan. with One from the Heart. And I didn't get to do it in the very end with no one to blame but myself, because of course whenever you do something innovative or that's not just what everyone does all the time, there's lots of resistance of like, oh, well, do we really have to do it this way? Can't we shoot it with one camera? Because if I light for one camera, I can make it more beautiful than if you have 20 cameras. And how do you light for 20 cameras? Well, the answer is you can. You do your best. And I've always, one of the few regrets in my life, of which I don't know if I even have another one, is that in those last weeks before we went with One from the Heart, I was weak enough to be prevailed upon to not go full live, which is what I wanted, and I regret. So we did end up shooting it one camera, one shot at a time. And so all that money we had spent to prepare to go into a live cinema situation ultimately was wasted, because we ended up shooting it one shot at a time, which means we had that post-production, whereas the original concept of One from the Heart was that it was going to be a finished film after this first week that we shot it, you know. Probably directing is tougher than writing, because writing, you're working only with extremely cooperative people who are people of your own imagination, whereas when you're actually directing, you're constantly trying to sell these other people a bill of goods as to why they should just maybe forego their own ideas for a minute and just do what you're asking them to do.
Good. Okay.
As a director, I would more make sure there were interesting props there, or kind of, you know, invite the actor in, so to speak, have their own ideas as to how they might do something.
Okay, action.
You sort of have to do a little sales job. You want to do something really difficult? Of course. Because what we could do is we could make a low camera and a high camera, which is added wear and tear on the director, just to really say, you know, hey, come along and see what I have in mind here, and then perhaps if that's not good, or if you could make a suggestion that's better, we'll explore that. It was interesting.
Hey, it's good, huh? It's good.
Directing is harder because you're constantly trying to convince people who are petrified to do it the way you're asking them to do it.
I didn't mean to tell you on that level. No, I understand.
The way I work has a built-in acceptance of that you're trying to create something that has life. So when something has life, it goes maybe differently than you might have preordained, you know. And I think having life in a film is what we're after, or in any work of art, the flame of life. I mean, we're trying to be, in a way, like God, in that we want to create something that lives. And to do that, you can't be too tight and controlling, because that will stifle life, yet you can't be too widely permitting, as that will put it out of control. So you have to do both, just like in raising a child, or managing a husband, or a boyfriend or a girlfriend. You have to try to feel sympathetic enough with the vital urges of this thing or person or work, that you're both permissive and somewhat restraining at the same time. So it's the trick of how to do that. Jimmy Caan was extremely funny, and you know, he had come from a neighborhood not far from where I lived, near Woodside and Sunnyside in Queens in New York, and you know, he had a swagger, and he was always laughing and cracking jokes, and you know, he was on all the time, as we say, and also he had all the insecurities that actors often have, especially the ones who are on all the time and joking that they are hiding a greater insecurity. I remember when we had the cut of The Godfather, he was very disturbed that, you know, how some parts of his performance were left in and other parts, which is always the case, were taken out, and he thought I was making a mistake the way I was doing it, and so he was going to bring a friend of his who was an expert, an actor who was on television on a show called Get Smart. I think his name was Don Adams, to come and to check whether or not the way Sonny was cut in The Godfather was okay. I always thought that was funny. The other thing you learn is with actors, is something I learned a long time in the theater, is if you're working on a play and all the actors think you're wonderful and they love working with you and they just think you're the most wonderful director, and the play is a flop, then they're going to say it was awful working with them. And by the other hand, if you work with actors and you're mean and you're yelling at them and you're not nice at all and you're awful, if the show is a success, they can say, oh, he was the most wonderful director. So it really only depends on what the success of the project is.
This is a conspiracy.
Marlon Brando did not just appear with everything looking like The Godfather. When I saw him that morning, I went to his house. I was invited to go to his house, and early in the morning, he came out of his bedroom with a long blonde ponytail and a Japanese robe. He was about 47 years old, so he didn't look anything like an aging mafia figure. But with few words, I had brought plates of Italian cold cuts and boxes of little Italian cigars and just props, which often is the way I like to work with actors, where I don't really tell the actor much, but I just put around things that he might choose to select, which would help him arrive at a character. And Brando just kind of came out, as I said, looking with his long blonde hair and, you know, quite young. And ultimately he took his hair and he rolled it up and he knew how to put it in a bun, and he got some shoe polish and he made the hair dark and took off the robe and put on this white shirt that I think I had brought. I remember him talking about the collar. He said, oh, those Italian guys, the collar is always like bent, and it's like I started doing that, you know, and he was working on little details, and he started talking without talking, and taking a little bit of the cheese and took the cigar. And then it was really funny because at one moment the phone rang, his phone, and he went, you know, I always wondered what the person who called thought, to just get, you know. And he was clearly, and then he took some Kleenex, rolled it up in little balls, and he said, I think you should have the face of a bulldog. And he stuffed this in like that, going like that. And I was shooting it all with the little video camera. And it was like a transformation in front of my eyes. And he said, well, you know, he's shot in the throat in the story, or he's shot. He said, maybe after that you ought to talk like with a rasp, you know. Marlon Brando was a playful person. He was a childlike person, and if he was sometimes irresponsible or showed up without losing the weight he said he would do, or if he was maybe stalling, you know, talking about things, which was whatever he talked about was always interesting. Maybe it was just because he was a little, like anybody, reluctant to jump in and start acting, you know. Just because he wasn't Marlon Brando doesn't mean he wasn't frightened to start.
This film is a $20 million disaster. Why won't anyone believe me? I'm thinking of shooting myself.
Of course, I had my problems with Apocalypse Now. I mean, I was running out of money and I had to get Marlon Brando to ultimately arrive at some idea with me that we could actually film, because he didn't look like a, you know, an army colonel or anything. But, you know, I didn't cajole him, you know. I basically engaged with him, and in the end, you know, he was just a very interesting man, a little bit, you know, you have to realize he had been Marlon Brando ever since he was 24, so he had lived in a fairyland, you know, as those people who are celebrities when they're very young must be. People making a fuss over him, people trying to manipulate him. That's why Marlon liked best like children or animals or people who weren't coming at him with an agenda, I think. But, you know, he was a nice person. The Oscar that meant the most to me was And it's hard now because I have several relatives, 3 in fact, who have won them, but the biggest thrill was to see my father win the Oscar. And actually get to see him win an Oscar was like the payoff of a wonderful, of my childhood, to see the father that I hoped so much would be successful. With my daughter, of course, it was equally a thrill, but in a sense, she was so young and beautiful that, you know, she'll win other Oscars even, but there'll be other people in our family. Jason Schwartzman is my nephew is a tremendous talent, I think, and his brothers, and also Nicholas Cage has won an Oscar. So I'm sure some of these other young people will definitely win that and hopefully other awards.
Action!
Because of my brother's influence, I was very impressed with the films of Alexander Korda and the films made in that great period of British films, not only The Thief of Baghdad, but The Man Who Could Work Miracles with Roland Young, The Shape of Things to Come. I love that film, and Four Feathers. So I mean, I think the British productions of Korda and of the Arrows, Michael Powell and Emrys Pressburger, and, you know, The Red Shoes and Tales of Hoffman. I would say I had a special fascination. And of course, all the American films that were the universal Dracula and Frankenstein and the Wolfman, and Abbott and Costello meet Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman. So I think the films I want to make, especially now in this new situation, are films that are like questions, and the answer is the finished film.
Okay, next case.
Take 3, camera 8.
I think I was very wise in understanding when I did that the motion picture and entertainment business was not really a business. It was not a real business, because ultimately it was a business for the distributor, because ultimately the proceeds of the movies all go to the distributor into the hopper and then trickles down and finally gets to the people who made the film at the end, and the motion picture business, even for the distributor, was not what we call a real business, because, you know, it could be great one year and then it was nothing the next, whereas there are businesses, the wine business, the resort business, and other businesses like that, that every year ultimately you get paid. I mean, and if you do a good job, you could actually grow it to double it, and the next year double it, and then next year double it and double it, so that it really is a reliable business, and that if I had a foundation in more real business, then that would help me subsidize maybe my interest in the not real businesses like the film business, which has come true. So one of the wisest things I did was to take my emphasis out of making a living from the movies and move it into, you know, having my own company.
Hey, have a lot of fun.
I think my best advice is really contained in the story of what happened to me when I wrote the screenplay of the film Patton. One of the reasons they explained that they didn't like it was the opening. In the opening, I had this unusual opening where the character Patton comes right up on front of a big flag and makes a speech. And he's a 4-star general, and he has medals and awards and pistols, and he's making this speech. And they said to me, it's very confusing, this speech. First of all, to start a movie, not only with a speech like that, but then in the scene right after it, he only has 2 stars, and he doesn't have the medals. It will be very confusing, and we don't like the beginning. Well, eventually, they did find an actor who liked it, George Scott, and a director who that opening appealed to, and who shot it wonderfully, and that is considered one of the most effective openings in the movie canon, which means, young people, that the things you get fired for when you're young are the same things you win awards for when you're old. So you have to be very courageous about your ideas, because it's not their fault. It's just that when you come up with really something good, it means it's different, and it's different from what they expect, and they're likely to fire you or discredit you. But you know, years later, if you survive, they'll bring it out as one of the great things you did. So if George Lucas and Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg and myself were in a room, what would be talked about? And it would be possible that it would be talking about movies that one of them would have seen something really wonderful and they'd start to describe it, because I think the cinema is something that is really, you never lose interest in, and you're always in awe over how amazingly flexible and magical and ever-changing it is. So I think easily that directors of that level could talk about those things, or they might be talking about their kids or their families, or you know, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were talking about films.